So, will the U.S. fall into a recession this year, or is the recent data signs that the U.S. economy will remain resilient? To discuss more, we are joined by Muhammad Faisal, Executive Director of Core Indonesia think tank. Good afternoon, Dr. Faisal. Thank you so much for joining us again.
Good afternoon, Mas Krishna. Thank you for having me.
Right, so first let's review U.S. economic performance in 2022. As we saw just now, 2.1% growth overall in 2022. Unemployment at record lows, inflation continuing to slow down to 5%. Are these all reassuring signs that the U.S. economy is still resilient?
Yep. Thank you. In my opinion, I think it is indeed an indication that the global economy, especially the U.S. economy, is not as gloomy as expected. So first of all, we've talked about it last week, that China has started to rebound, given a slow recovery, but not as bad as during the lockdown period last year. And now we see that the U.S. economy also in the fourth quarter apparently still shows a positive growth, 2.9% in the fourth quarter, which is stronger than expected. And weekly jobless claim fell by 6,000, which is the lowest reading since April 2022, I think. And consumer spending is also resilient. Government and private sector investments are strong. However, this does not necessarily imply that the U.S. economy will be stronger enough this year, because there are a number of factors to be considered. So first is the lagging impacts of the Fed fund rate hikes, which has started last year on consumption and the real sector, which has not been probably seen last year, but it will be seen this year. And the second one is the China's economic recovery that will increase global demand, especially for commodities and energy, which in turn will boost inflation in the U.S. as well. So that there are the two factors that to be considered when we talk about the potential of recessions in the U.S.
All right, so I want to go back on the point of the Fed rate hikes. This is what is concerning for the markets as well. The Fed hiked rates aggressively 7 times in 2022. At what point this year will the U.S. economy start to feel the impact of those rate hikes?
So first of all, the Chinese factor will make it more difficult for the Fed to fight against inflation. And I think it will continue to be hawkish this year. And I think the larger impact of the Fed hikes last year, and which also will be still the case this year, will probably be seen in the second quarter, which can be indicated by, for example, a weaker consumer spending and also a weaker real sector growth in the U.S.
Right. So how much will consumer spending and sort of the real estate, fall this year? And will that push the U.S. economy into a recession? I know the U.S. Treasury Secretary, Janet Yellen, says she does not want to rule out a recession. Do you think the U.S. will fall into a recession this year?
Well, I think the U.S. economy may not be as weak as many people have expected, but I think it also will not be as strong or as positive as what has been indicated by the GDP growth in the fourth quarter. We also need to take into account the lagging impacts of the Fed rates hikes on consumers and real sectors this year. So I think inflation was probably still above 3% in the first half of this year, which is still relatively higher than that during the pre-pandemic era, particularly in the first half of 2023. So I think the chance of recession is still 50-50. But I think the worst situation that might happen is a mild recession, which is indicated by a mild negative growth, not a deep recession. We're not talking of deep recession as occurred in 2020 during the COVID-19 hikes for the first time. And then it is also indicated by a moderate inflation. So it may not be as high as the inflation last year, but it is also relatively not as many people expected, which is 2 to 3%. The target is 2 to 3%. But so it's a moderate inflation between 3 to 5% in the first half of 2023, and also a relatively conducive labor market. But things might change if there is unexpected dynamics of geopolitical conflicts, not only not only a Russia-Ukraine war, but also others, like, for example, the increasing tension or possible increasing tensions between China and the U.S.
Right. But as it stands right now, with the conditions at the moment and the data we're seeing at the moment, you're forecasting a mild recession that is in the fourth quarter, if I'm not wrong?
Yes, if I'm not mistaken, I think the mild recession, I think it will probably from 0 to -2% for 2 quarters, starting in the third quarter. So the negative growth will start in the third quarter and fourth quarter, so 2 consecutive quarters. So that means that the recession will start in the fourth quarter.
And we're still some months away, but how long do you think it could last, that mild recession in the U.S.?
Well, I think at least it will last, I think, for 2 quarters. If we look at the historical data, I think it is less likely to last longer than 2 quarters.
Right. 2 quarters, meaning after the third and fourth quarter, it would be the first and second quarter in 2024?
That's right. That's right. Yes.
Right. Okay, so if the U.S. does fall into a recession this year, what will be sort of the major impacts to the Indonesian economy?
I think there will be a slight impact on Indonesian economic growth. Core Indonesia have predicted that actually Indonesian economic growth this year will grow at a rate of 4.5 to 5%, within this range. So if the U.S. have a recession this year, I think the impact will make the Indonesian economic growth down to 4.5%. So it will not be lower than that, because first, Indonesia has a strong domestic demand, and the second one is the Chinese factor, because China has also removed the zero COVID policy. So, but however, there might be a few sectors that will still be severe, especially textile and footwear, because most of our exports for textile and footwear products is going to the US and also to the European Union. So these 2 sectors may still, I think, have the worst impacts amongst the various sectors in Indonesia.
Right, and of course, the textile sector, they saw some mass layoffs last year.
That's right.
So if the U.S. fell into a recession, would we see more layoffs, perhaps, in such sectors such as textile?
Yeah, I think the risk is still there for 2023, because there's also a risk of normalization, especially fiscal normalizations in Indonesia this year. If it is not taken into account carefully, I think the layoff will still continue this year for these 2 sectors.
All right, and what about investments? Because in 2022, U.S. investments, they fell. They were the top 4th investor in 2021. The U.S. fell to 6th place in 2022. Do you see less U.S. investments this year?
Yeah, I think it is likely that the U.S. investments in Indonesia will fall this year, following the conditions in the U.S. itself. So, but I think the drop of the rank of the U.S. investment is also due to an increase of investments by other countries, especially by Chinese investors, for example. And if we look at the characteristics or the nature of U.S. investments in Indonesia is actually mostly in the mining sector. And these sectors actually have been, the darling for many investors, not only by the U.S., but also by China, Singapore, Hong Kong, and many others. So I think it is also due to an increase of investments by other countries. But of course, the condition in the U.S. also have an impact on the investments itself.
But overall, would you say if the U.S. fell into a mild recession, starting from the third quarter, in your forecast, will the impact to Indonesia be major or not as much?
Not as much. I think overall, and from the macroeconomic perspective, I think it will only impact mild, which is about 4 point. So the GDP growth was still 4.5% or higher, but some sectors will be severe, because these sectors like textile and also footwear, they depend on the U.S. market for exports.